There's a hollow in eastern Kentucky where the census takers used to stop at the ridge line, not because the road ended, not because the maps ran out. They stopped because the families living in that valley had been flagged by the state medical examiner's office in 1912 with a single word stamped across their files in red ink: unclassifiable. For 3 generations, children were born in that hollow with skin the color of a winter sky before snow, not pale, not albino, blue, a blue so deep and so wrong that when the first photographs were taken in 1960, the developers thought the film had been damaged. They hadn't. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It isn't Appalachian legend or campfire myth. It's the documented medical history of a family that became a genetic event so rare, so biologically disturbing, that scientists are still studying their blood today. This is the story of the Blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek. And the reason their name carries weight in modern hematology textbooks has nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with what happens when isolation, geography, and a single recessive gene converge in the mountains where no one was watching. The Fugate line begins in 1820, when a French orphan named Martin Fugate arrived in the wilderness of eastern Kentucky and married a woman named Elizabeth Smith. They settled near the headwaters of Troublesome Creek, a place so remote that marriage options were limited to neighboring families or bloodlines that had already intertwined. Martin Fugate carried something in his blood that no one could see. A mutation, recessive, dormant, waiting. Elizabeth Smith, by a coincidence that still makes geneticists go quiet when they review the case files, carried the exact same mutation. Their children were born blue. Not bruised, not oxygen deprived, blue in the skin, in the nail beds, in the lips, and they lived, they grew, they married each other, and the blue spread through the family tree like a stain. By 1890, the Fugate family had fractured into dozens of branches spread across the hills and creeks of rural Kentucky, but the gene pool had never widened. They married within the same 5 or 6 family names. Combs, Smith, Ritchie, Fugate. The isolation wasn't just geographic, it was social. People in the surrounding towns had started to notice. They called them the Blue People. Some said it was a curse. Others said it was punishment. The local preachers wouldn't baptize them in the same water as other families. When a Fugate child was born with that unmistakable discoloration, midwives would sometimes refuse to record the birth. There are gaps in the county records that line up too perfectly with known Fugate births to be coincidence. The family learned to stay hidden. They built their homes farther up the ridges. They stopped coming into town except when absolutely necessary. And when they did, they covered their skin, long sleeves in summer, hats pulled low. They became a whisper in the valley, a family people pointed at but never spoke to, and for 70 years, no one knew why. The medical explanation wouldn't come until 1960, when a hematologist named Madison Cowan arrived in Hazard, Kentucky, chasing a mystery he'd read about in a single, obscure paragraph of a medical journal. The paragraph described a rare blood disorder called methemoglobinemia, a condition where the blood carries a mutated form of hemoglobin that cannot properly bond with oxygen. The result is blood that runs dark, almost purple, beneath the skin. And in people with pale complexions, that blood shows through as blue. Cowan had never seen a case in person. Most hematologists never do. It's vanishingly rare, but he'd heard rumors. Stories from older doctors in the region about families up in the hills who'd been blue for as long as anyone could remember. He started asking around, and eventually someone told him about Troublesome Creek. What Cowan found when he arrived wasn't a handful of isolated cases. It was a living genetic study that had been hiding in plain sight for over a century. He met a woman named Luna Fugate who was in her 80s and had been blue her entire life. Her skin, even in old age, carried that faint grayish, blue tint that photographs could never quite capture. She told him about her father, her uncles, her cousins. She drew out a family tree on a piece of paper, and Kawin realized what he was looking at. This wasn't random mutation. This was inbreeding on a scale that had allowed a recessive gene to express itself over and over again across multiple generations. The Fugates had, without knowing it, become one of the most extreme examples of genetic isolation ever documented in American history. Kawin spent months in those hills, drawing blood samples, taking photographs, interviewing family members who'd spent their entire lives believing they were cursed. He found descendants who were still blue. Not all of them. The gene was recessive, which meant it only showed up when both parents carried it. But in a family that had been marrying cousins and second cousins for 5 generations, the odds weren't just possible. They were inevitable. He tested their blood under a microscope and confirmed what he'd suspected: methemoglobinemia, specifically a hereditary form caused by a deficiency in an enzyme called cytochrome B5 reductase. Without that enzyme, the hemoglobin in their blood couldn't convert back to its oxygen-carrying form. It stayed in a reduced state, dark and oxygen-starved, even though their lungs were working fine. They weren't suffocating, their blood just looked like they were. But here's what made the Fugate case different from every other documented instance of methemoglobinemia in medical literature: they weren't sick. Most people born with this condition suffer from developmental delays, neurological damage, seizures. The Fugates had none of that. They lived long lives, they had children, they worked the land. Apart from the color of their skin, they were functionally normal. Kawin couldn't explain it at first. The genetic mutation should have been devastating, but something about the specific way it expressed in the Fugate line had rendered it almost cosmetic. Almost, because even though they weren't dying, they were living in a kind of social death. Shunned, hidden, erased from the record, Kawin did something that no one had done before. He treated them. He gave them a simple compound called methylene blue, a dye that forces the blood to release oxygen properly. Within minutes, their skin began to change. The blue faded. Pink returned to their lips, their fingertips, their faces. For the first time in their lives, some of them looked like everyone else. Luna Fugate cried when she saw herself in the mirror. She was 68 years old. One of her relatives, a man named Benjamin Stacy, refused the treatment. He said he'd been blue his whole life and didn't see the point in changing now. He died blue in 1985. His death certificate listed the cause as natural, but under notable conditions. The attending physician wrote one word: cyanosis. It wasn't accurate, but it was the only medical term anyone knew to describe what they were looking at. The Fugate case should have ended there. A rare genetic anomaly, treated and understood, filed away in medical journals as a footnote in the history of inherited blood disorders. But it didn't end, because what the Fugates represented wasn't just a biological curiosity. It was a window into something darker and more unsettling about American isolation, about what happens when communities close in on themselves for so long that the gene pool becomes a closed loop. The Fugates weren't the only family this happened to. They were just the most visible. In the same region, there were other families with other mutations, families where dwarfism appeared in nearly every generation, families where polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, became so common it stopped being remarked upon. Families where congenital deafness ran so deep that entire households communicated only in a homemade sign language no outsider could interpret. The mountains kept secrets, and the families living in them became those secrets. Modern geneticists still study the Fugate bloodline, not because methemoglobinemia is particularly dangerous, but because the family tree itself is a perfect model of what scientists call a founder effect. When a small population becomes isolated and begins reproducing within itself, any rare genetic trait carried by the founders gets amplified across generations. It's how certain populations develop unique hereditary diseases. It's how entire ethnic groups can carry markers for conditions that don't appear anywhere else in the world. The Fugates are taught in medical schools now, not as a tragedy, but as a case study, a demonstration of what happens when geography and genetics collide. But the textbooks don't talk about what it felt like to be blue in a world that demanded you be anything else. They don't talk about the children who were hidden in back rooms when visitors came. They don't talk about the women who were told they couldn't marry outside the family because no one else would have them. There's a photograph that survived from 1975. It shows a family reunion in Troublesome Creek. Dozens of Fugates gathered on a hillside, multiple generations, some blue, some not. In the back row, standing slightly apart from the others, is a teenage boy with his arms crossed and his face turned away from the camera. His skin has that telltale grayish, blue tone. His name was Dennis Stacy, and he was one of the last Fugates born with the condition. He died in 2004, never married, never left Kentucky. In his obituary, published in the Hazard Herald, there's no mention of his skin, no mention of the family history, just his name, his birth date, and a single line he kept to himself. That's how the story ends for most of them, not with scientific breakthrough or public understanding, but with quiet erasure. The kind of silence that gets mistaken for peace. Here's what the medical journals don't tell you. The treatment Cowan offered in 1960 worked, but it wasn't permanent. Methylene blue had to be taken regularly, sometimes daily, to keep the skin from returning to that deep slate color. And for many of the Fugates, the choice wasn't as simple as taking a pill, because being blue wasn't just a medical condition by that point. It was identity, it was lineage. For over a century, they had been defined by that single visible difference, and removing it didn't erase the stigma. It didn't change how they were seen. Some of them took the treatment and moved away, started new lives in cities where no one knew their name. Others stayed. They kept living in the same hollows, the same houses their great-grandparents had built, and they let the blue return. There's a kind of defiance in that, a refusal to be fixed when the world had already decided you were broken. By the 1980s, the Fugate family had largely dispersed. Younger generations married outside the bloodline. The gene became diluted. Births of blue children became rarer and then stopped altogether. The last known case was a boy born in 1975, whose blue skin faded within the first few weeks of life as his enzymes stabilized. But the legacy didn't fade. Researchers from universities across the country still request access to the Fugate family records. Blood samples taken in the 1960s are still stored in labs, still studied, still referenced in genetic research papers. The Fugates gave science something it couldn't replicate in a controlled environment. A multi-generational, real-world example of recessive inheritance playing out across time with almost no external genetic interference. They became data, and no one asked them if that was what they wanted. There's a cemetery outside Troublesome Creek where many of the original Fugates are buried. The headstones are simple, names and dates, nothing more. But if you know what to look for, you can trace the family lines just by reading the stones. The same last names appear over and over. Fugate, Combs, Ritchie, Smith, married to each other, buried beside each other, generation after generation. And scratched into the back of one of the stones, barely visible unless the light hits it right, someone carved a single sentence: We were here, and we were real. No one knows who carved it or when. But it's still there. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have taken the treatment? Would you have left? Or would you have stayed blue? The deeper you dig into the Fugate story, the more you realize it's not really about a blood disorder. It's about what America does to people it can't categorize. The Fugates were poor, rural, and visibly different in a way that couldn't be hidden or explained away. They lived in a part of the country that had already been written off by the rest of the nation as backwards, ignorant, expendable. And when their children were born blue, no one came to help. No government agency. No medical outreach. For over 100 years, they were left to figure it out on their own. The same state that kept records of their existence did nothing to understand it. They were observed, documented, and abandoned. And that abandonment is what allowed the gene to concentrate the way it did. If there had been intervention, if there had been education or resources, or even just basic medical curiosity before 1960, the Fugate line might have looked completely different. But there wasn't, so they married each other, because that's what you do when no one else will have you. The methemoglobinemia gene still exists. It's still out there, carried by descendants who don't even know they have it. Because it's recessive, most carriers live their entire lives without ever expressing the trait. But every now and then, in rural hospitals across Appalachia, a baby is born with that same blue-gray skin, and doctors who have never seen it before panic. They run tests, they call specialists, and eventually someone pulls up the Fugate case and realizes what they're looking at. It happened as recently as 2019. A child born in eastern Tennessee, blue at birth, rushed to a neonatal intensive care unit where doctors initially suspected a heart defect. It wasn't until genetic testing came back that they understood. The child was a Fugate descendant. The family hadn't known. They'd never heard the story. The gene had been silent for 2 generations, waiting. That's the thing about genetic inheritance. It doesn't forget. It doesn't care how much time has passed, or how far you've moved, or how much you've tried to blend in. It carries forward, invisible, until the moment it's not. And when it resurfaces, it forces you to confront a history you didn't know you had. The 2019 case was treated with methylene blue. The child's skin returned to normal within hours. The parents were told it was harmless, cosmetic, nothing to worry about. But they took their baby home to a town where everyone had already seen the pictures, where the story had already spread, and they had to decide, just like the Fugates did a century before, whether to explain or to run. There's a question that hovers over the entire Fugate story, and it's the one no one wants to ask out loud. If they had been born anywhere else to anyone else, would it have mattered? If the same genetic mutation had appeared in a wealthy family in Boston or Philadelphia, would doctors have arrived sooner? Would the treatment have come faster? Would they have been turned into a spectacle, photographed for medical journals, and paraded as a curiosity? Or would they have been quietly cared for behind closed doors where no one had to see? The answer sits heavy in the silence, because the Fugates were poor, they were Appalachian, they were isolated in a way that made them easy to ignore and easier to exploit. And when the scientists finally did come, it wasn't to help. It was to study, to document, to take their blood and their story and turn it into something publishable. The Fugates gave informed consent, but consent under desperation isn't really consent. It's surrender. In 2003, a documentary crew tried to find living members of the Fugate family. They wanted interviews, photographs, updated family trees. They were told, politely but firmly, to leave. The family had been poked and prodded enough. They didn't want to be a story anymore. They didn't want their children's faces on television or their genetic code discussed in lecture halls. They wanted what they'd always wanted, to be left alone. And that request, that boundary, is still being violated, because this video exists, because articles are still written, because the Fugate name still gets typed into search engines by people looking for something strange, something disturbing, something other. The story won't let them rest. Even the ones who were never blue carry the weight of it. The last time anyone saw a confirmed Fugate descendant with visible methemoglobinemia was in the late 1980s, a woman in her 70s who lived alone in a cabin near the original family homestead. She refused visitors, she refused treatment. When she died, her body was found by a neighbor who said her skin had gone pale in death. The blue finally faded. She was buried without a funeral in an unmarked grave at her own request. No name, no date, just dirt and stone. And maybe that's the only mercy the world ever gave her. The chance to disappear completely. The scientists still have the blood samples, the genetic data, the photographs. The Fugate family is stored in databases and freezers and filing cabinets in universities they'll never see. Their legacy isn't in the mountains anymore. It's in the institutions that took pieces of them and never gave anything back. And if you're listening to this and you feel something uncomfortable settling in your chest, good, you should, because this isn't ancient history. This is 1960. This is 2019. This is now. The Fugates aren't a ghost story. They're a mirror, and what we see reflected back is a country that has always been more interested in studying suffering than ending it. They were blue because of blood, but they were forgotten because of choice. Knowers,